In the summer of 2019, a friend of mine from India traveled to Moscow and St. Petersburg. When I heard about it, I wondered if perhaps it would be nice to travel to Russia as well and meet up, as chances to get together are sparse due to the long distance between our homes. And even though the timing wasn't perfect and I would probably have picked different cities to visit in Russia, I spontaneously did go. And I really ended up enjoying it, Moscow quickly proving to be one of the best places I would ever have visited. The Russian Federation is often underestimated by Westerners when it comes to tourism, which I've always found sad. I myself have been studying Russian for a while now and been interested in Russia and Eastern Europe in general for several years. And Moscow definitely doesn't disappoint, although, like every city that sees a lot of tourists every year, there were some overly crowded places crawling with fellow travelers, which is something I usually choose to avoid. A very good choice I made was to book an accommodation far out in the suburbs rather than downtown, which provided a very calm environment and immediately gave me a first glimpse into more quotidian life. Of course, I probably barely scratched the surface of this enormous city, but nevertheless, I felt more connected to the place than I would have if I had just followed others along the beaten track. As most of you probably already know, Moscow is the capital city of the Russian Federation, located in northeastern Europe. With its massive population of 12 million inhabitants, it is the biggest city entirely located in what is usually considered to be Europe, as well as the largest city in the world where Slavic language is dominant. It is called Moskva in Russian and named after the river of the same name that flows through it. My first impression of the place was that it was very well organized, making things very easy for foreign travelers, even people whose Russian skills are still at a beginner stage, like mine. I also noticed that Moscow, despite its high population, doesn't feel crowded most of the time, as everything is very widely spaced out. Moscow also seemed very clean to me, much more so than most Western European cities, where garbage is usually lying around everywhere. On the first day after my arrival, I spent an entire morning on doing one of the things I love to do the most, using public transportation. As a man with a keen interest in infrastructure, I find the traffic network of every settlement among the most interesting things to experience and be a part of. With over 15 lines and over 250 stations, the network is quite dense and can take you all around the place very fast. The fare is comfortably low, and the trains operate at a frequency of sometimes less than 2 minutes. The network is largely subterranean and very far down in the ground with endless seeming escalators. The Moscow Metro is not only by far the best means of transportation to travel around the city, but also an attraction in itself. Within stations, the platforms are usually connected through long tunnels, many of which are as neatly decorated as the platforms. The Moscow Metro is famed worldwide for its beautifully decorated stations, many of which could be described as palace-like.
The next station is Prospect Mira. Уважаемые пассажиры, будьте взаимно вежливы. Уступайте места инвалидам, пожилым людям, пассажирам с детьми и беременным женщинам. Уважаемые пассажиры, будьте внимательны и осторожны при выходе из вагона.
Another thing I loved about Moscow were the incredibly wide open sidewalks, which are an absolute delight for people like me who like their space. I visited Poklonaya Gora, a hill in southwestern Moscow, where Park Pobyedy, Victory Park, is located, commemorating the Russian victories over Napoleon and Nazi Germany. Inaugurated as an open-air museum by the Soviets, but including monuments from even earlier times, the complex includes a museum about World War II, a church, a mosque, and a memorial synagogue dedicated to the Jewish victims of the Holocaust. Although Russia is often associated with communism and socialism, the Russian Federation has actually become very capitalist in recent years. Moscow is no exception to the growing trend of huge malls full of expensive retailers popping up all over the world in larger cities, all of them looking pretty much alike and following the same goal: to make rich people richer and to get the status-obsessed globalized generations of the world to contribute to that, be it in the US, in Russia, in Singapore, or wherever else. But in many ways, Russia still retains a lot of socialist attitudes, for example in the way that it provides its citizens with efficient and affordable public transportation, the likes that people in Western cities can only dream of. Beside the metro system, Moscow also has a dense tram system, boasting 40 lines, making it the fourth largest tram system in the world. The downtown area is where most of Moscow's best-known attractions can be found within walking distance from one another, including the State Historical Museum, which you can see in this shot. St. Basil's Cathedral and the Kremlin are only a few meters away, as well as this building, the famous Bolshoi Theater. While I was in Moscow, I met up with a local friend of mine who took me to this very special arcade museum, where you can play original arcade games from Soviet times. The pedestrian zones in downtown Moscow were some of the most surprising places in the city, as they probably resembled Western European cities the most. Although Moscow is not overly far from the area I grew up, given how small Europe is compared to other continental concepts, the architecture and city planning overall felt very distinct to me, but the pedestrian zones really reminded me of home, the only major difference being that downtown Moscow is much cleaner than most major Western European cities. Nevertheless, paired with how many tourists accumulated there, I tried my best not to spend overly much time there, and instead spent as much time as I could in the suburbs and in places where I could observe infrastructure in action. Still, I did spend one portion of a day downtown with my friends from India to check out the most well-known attractions. I took these shots rather early in the morning before meeting my friends, when it was still somewhat empty. The architecture around Krasnaya Ploshchad, Red Square, is truly magnificent and definitely worth checking out, just not worthy of stealing all the attention. St. Basil's Cathedral is probably the most well-known icon of the city, as well as the Russian Federation as a whole, with its delicious-looking towers that truly gave me Christmas vibes, even though it was mid-June and temperatures were usually around 30 degrees Celsius during the day. The towers belong to the different churches, and their domes are supposed to imitate flames, specifically bonfires. After waiting in line for a long time, we entered the famed Kremlin of Moscow. Although usually symbolically associated with Russian politics, the Kremlin is actually a fortification consisting of walls and towers and housing 4 cathedrals and 5 palaces. The Russian word Kreml, from which the word Kremlin derives, simply means castle, fortress, or citadel. All over Russia, there are many other Kremlins. As mentioned before, it was very hot and dry during my stay. As a person who likes cold and rainy weather, I was very thankful when a truck drove past me inside the Kremlin complex, spraying water all over the road to clean it. Sadly, the driver directed the water beam away from us tourists, but I nevertheless got a nice wet breeze. Moscow features a humid continental climate with ice-cold snowy winters and brutally hot dry summers. I would love to see the city covered in white someday, and hopefully winter will also see less tourism overall. The next day, I was on my own again and took a little tour into the northern parts of Moscow. My first stop was a little touristy again, but far less so than the downtown areas. One thing that Russia is famous for is space travel, to which a museum and several monuments in the city are dedicated, most of them located close to one another. In order to get there, I rode a monorail train, adding even more diversity to Moscow's already pretty exciting public transportation system.
Осторожно, двери закрываются. Следующая станция – Телецентр.
The next station is Telecenter.
Tourists who don't know Russian have a surprisingly easy time getting by, as signs and metro announcements are usually available in English. Sadly, fluency in English is rare among Russian citizens, even in Moscow. Considering how important the Russian language is as a lingua franca across Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and Siberia, which covers an enormous portion of land area on this planet, it comes as no surprise, however, that Russian speakers commonly don't need to learn other languages, as Russian already gets them pretty far. Nevertheless, a keen interest in languages is existent. In fact, my Moscow-based friend and I actually bonded over our shared passion for languages when we first met. He runs a very successful Russian language YouTube channel in which he humorously introduces people to various languages of the world and encourages them to learn them. I will leave a link to his channel in the video description in case you're interested. If you're an intermediate or advanced learner of Russian, his way of speaking might be quite intelligible to you and act as an excellent listening comprehension exercise. Adjacent to the space travel-related attractions is the Выставка достижений народного хозяйства, commonly shortened to VDNKH, a park and exhibition center containing, among other things, several pavilions dedicated to nations that used to be part of the Soviet Union, as well as to regions administered by the Russian Federation today that have their own cultural, ethnic, and linguistic identities. This enormous structure on top of the Museum of Cosmonautics is called the Monument to the Conquerors of Space, commemorating Soviet space exploration. I myself have a rather strange relationship with outer space, as it is something that both terrifies and fascinates me. Although fear usually trumps my fascination, I did enter the museum and, despite how full it was, found it quite enjoyable. Many years ago, I first learned about the story of Laika, a dog from the streets of Moscow that was captured for a space mission during Soviet times, in which she was sent into the Earth's orbit aboard Sputnik 2. The mission never planned her return, and the plan was to feed her a poison after the experiments were carried out. However, Laika the dog died a probably much more painful death much earlier than expected, possibly from a heat stroke as a result of a technical failure. This story still haunts me to this day, probably as a combined result of my profound love for dogs and my fear of anything space-related. I reunited with my friends from India that evening to visit Gorky Park, which includes the Museon sculpture exhibit, an outdoor part of the Tretyakov Gallery that shows monuments, statues, and other sculptures, including those of political figures that are not glorified anymore. Back in the suburbs and off the beaten track the next day, I set out to find two things that I always find interesting, although in totally different ways. And conveniently, they were located right next to each other. For the first time, I had to get on a rather long tram ride to get somewhere. Something that I always find interesting is how religions that are not practiced by the dominating majority are represented in a place. And so, one of the two destinations that day was the Moskovskaya Sobornaya Mechit, the Moscow Cathedral Mosque. It is the main Islamic house of worship in the city, although by far not the most important one in the country. The Russian Federation administers a lot of ethnicities, many of which have their own autonomous administrative entities within the federal network. And a lot of them, including for example the Tatars, predominantly practice Islam. The mosque is located at the site of a former mosque, which was demolished in 2011. The inauguration of the current structure was as recently as 2015. The second thing that I wanted to see, although dull from the outside compared to the hauntingly beautiful mosque building, is the Olympic Stadium of Moscow, which housed the 1980 Olympic Summer Games and the 2009 Eurovision Song Contest. The stadium was actually demolished very shortly after my visit, meaning that I, as a big Eurovision fan, pretty much caught my last chance to see the place by sheer coincidence. And this is pretty much all. As mentioned before, I'm very hopeful to be able to return to Moscow someday, as it is truly an amazing place to visit and one that I want to experience more, ideally during a colder season and with fewer tourists present. After my stay in Moscow, I traveled to St. Petersburg by train with my friends, where I also recorded some video footage, which I will publish someday as well. I apologize for the bad video quality, as I'm not very experienced with making videos yet. I hope you nevertheless enjoyed it. Хорошего дня! До свидания.